Indie author Kyle Doucette here. A little sunburned and a little scruffy, but oh well. In my last video, I talked a lot about a comic book I read when I was about 11 years old, and it was called What If Wolverine Became Lord of the Vampires? And inadvertently, that became the source of most of my vampire knowledge. These were basically the foundational rules that I used when coming up with my own vampires or vampire-like creatures in my own books, specifically in Larry's Cabin and the forthcoming They Feed at Night. And I realized after making the video that it was the first time I really had an idea of what Count Dracula himself was supposed to look like and how he was supposed to act. Up until that point, I think memories of him were Scooby-Doo-like renditions and silly cartoons and the occasional clip from an old Hammer movie that was on late at night that I had no interest in watching because they looked boring. After reading that comic, though, of course my interest was piqued and I wanted to learn more about Dracula. So these were the pre-internet days, so I had a couple of sources. One was the encyclopedia, wasn't a whole lot there, and of course there was the actual novel, Bram Stoker's Dracula. Before I get into what I really think of the novel, I'm just going to say that from the best that I can tell, Bram Stoker's Dracula had the same effect that, say, Star Wars had on Hollywood and the movie business as a whole, because in the movie business there is a before Star Wars and an after Star Wars. And Bram Stoker's Dracula had basically the effect of taking these Eastern European folklore type creatures, combining a lot of their tropes, their traits, the legends, and putting it all into one reasonably succinct story and pinning all of those traits and talents and abilities onto one character. As far as I can tell from looking into this, there was a before Dracula and an after Dracula, because before Dracula, it was just a lot of Eastern folklore legends that were kind of making their way into Western Europe. And because of the Gothic storytelling novel phase at that time, vampires were occasionally mentioned. But apparently Bram Stoker was the one who made it very, very horrific and put it all down on paper with a Eastern European character or this creature from the past attacking a modern metropolis or attacking people in what would be the modern age. And at the time he wrote this book, there were still vampire crazes going on in certain parts of Europe. Basically, where some people were convinced that someone who recently died was rising from the dead each night and feeding on their blood. This was like a panicked or a community panicked way of explaining why there was like a sickness or a virus or basically the equivalent of some community-wide infection that was making everybody listless. They were giving into their superstitions and they believed that there was some kind of creature or vampire-like creature responsible for it. There were recorded cases of people in France, Germany, and Eastern European countries going into the graveyards and digging up who they suspected might be the culprit. Not really clear on what they found though, but I know in some cases they staked or decapitated or burned the bodies. And at the time, what a vampire could do or what they threatened the community with was basically up to what the local superstitions were. Bram Stoker took all of that, put it into one novel, and then basically Western culture had a baseline for how a vampire is supposed to act, or what a vampire's limits are. Case in point is Sunlight. Now, I like the first two Blade movies, kind of the third one a little bit, as much as the next person, and Sunlight instantly deadly to them. And my own vampires, my own vampire-like creatures, Sunlight very, very dangerous for them. Their skin starts puckering and burning away right away, almost like they're being steamed or broiled. But in the old legends, it was unclear whether or not sunlight was harmful to them, because vampires could get up and walk during the day. Even in Bram Stoker's novel, it limited Dracula's powers, but he was able to wander around in daylight. The fangs, those were prevalent, so he included that. Pale skin included that. Being able to change appearances based on the amount of blood, depending on the amount of blood being drunk. Had a moment there where I wondered what was grammatically correct. How much blood he drank, how much blood being drunk, how much English, funny language. And of course, some of those old legends always involved some kind of mental abilities from the vampire. You know, coaxing somebody to go outside or putting somebody in a trance. Now, that is something that I have incorporated into my own stories, especially in Larry's Cabin and the forthcoming They Feed at Night, where a main vampire character is actually kind of clumsy when it comes to reading people's thoughts. Someone asked, what's the thing that you've written about that you're the most proud of so far? And I had to answer, I created a bumbling vampire who has the abilities but is stumbling through how to use them, but is still dangerous enough to cause a problem. Something else that seems to have originated completely with Bram Stoker is the invitation rule. Dracula is the first known mention, or at least the first known mention I can find, of a vampire needing permission to come into a home or to come into any building. Apparently, that was unclear before in vampire lore. My assumption is that there was no clear defined rule, and you always had to lock your door and bar the windows or the shutters for your own protection from anything from wild animals to prowlers to anyone trying to break in. And also, I get the idea that vampires, other than being able to raise themselves from the dead each night to go and feed on people, weren't that physically capable or imposing, which is why this always seemed to be something happening in their sleep. Now, with Dracula and Bram Stoker's contributions, Dracula is physically powerful. So I get why he added the invitation rule, because if he wanted, there'd be nothing to stop him from entering any home he wanted. That always kind of made me wonder what it would be like, say, if a vampire couldn't get entry into your home. Could he just pick a car up or something else that's heavy and huck it through the wall? That's something I might incorporate later into one of my stories. The invitation rule, though, again, I've always found fascinating, and kudos to Stoker for adding it because, again, vampires need to have serious limits, or at least our modern understanding of vampires need to have serious limits and rules governing them, or they would just be able to do whatever they want. They would ransack the world, be in charge, and take over the human population. Also, the invitation rule plays into a major fortified, claustrophobic feeling that I explore in Larry's Cabin, and made it as horrific and suspenseful as possible. There's a few touches of comedy there as well, so not to worry. Something I learned while doing research that surprised me, not shocked, but surprised me, was that Bram Stoker made no specific connection to Vlad the Impaler, the Romanian prince who was famous for impaling his enemies as a warning to any other invaders, or just a sign to show how badass he was. That is something modern vampire fans, or contemporary vampire fans, whatever's the correct phrasing to use, have pieced together themselves, and I'd like to think that as a creator, as the author of Dracula, Bram Stoker would be kicking himself in his grave for not making that connection himself, because that's probably one of the best origin stories ever for such a classic character. However, he picked Romania as the setting for Dracula's origin, because that's where most of the vampire lore came from. As well, he picked Dracula, the name, because he thought at the time it meant devil. I can't say anything about picking names, though. The name for the protagonist vampire in my book is Larry, so he wants to be known as Lawrence, but his prospective victims aren't playing ball with that. My thoughts on Bram Stoker's Dracula itself? I was not a fan. However, I see the potential in there, and I see what he was trying to do. When I first read it, everything in the introduction and from Jonathan Harker's perspective was fascinating. Creepy, exactly what you wanted it to be, as he's exploring that part of Wallachia and Dracula's rundown castle, as well as interacting with Dracula himself. There was this real sense of he's completely not in control of the situation, and Dracula has something horrible planned for him. My main problem with the book was that it was all epistolary. So everything was done through diary entries, letters, news reports, newspaper clippings, etc. And I got tired of that very, very quickly. I wanted to read a book. I wanted to read a scary and informative vampire story. I didn't want to feel like I was doing research, going through public records or whatnot, and trying to put together what kind of creature was roaming around London and where he came from. There's nothing wrong with third person all the way through, with the occasional diary entry or news report. Maybe it's because I like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle so much. Go with the third person or pick one character. If I were to rewrite it, it would have been either Harker, Mina, or Van Helsing as the main character being followed through in the first person or a basic third person narration. It could have all just been Jonathan Harker's journal entries or an interview given after the fact. The introduction of the book where the Count is gone and Harker's left with Dracula's wives, or concubines, or whatever they are. He escapes, and after that he gets back to London, and his journal picks up months later where he's putting together everything that's happening there. On the flip side, the story works just as well from the perspective of Mina Murray / Harker. She's in the thick of it and can be reporting on everything happening now that Dracula's in England. And she can report on the hunt, as well as being stalked and semi-seduced and semi-transformed into a vampire. Everything from Harker's side, as well as Quincy's and Seward's and what's his name? Van Helsing. All their contributions can go through her perspective. I think it would have worked perfectly well with her as the main third-person narrator. So overall, I did not like the book, and have not read it all the way through even once. What I have enjoyed more are everything from Orson Welles' classic radio play about Dracula, any production that the BBC has done as far as a Dracula radio play goes, or audio drama, whatever you want to call it. Those are far and away, like head and shoulders above the actual quality of the book, which I do have to describe as a slog. For my own stories, everything is in the third person. Sometimes it's omniscient. Other times it is third person, but from the perspective mainly of the character who's the focus of the chapter. In retrospect, I do think that, especially my first book, They Come Out at Night, would have benefited from some of that epistolary work with the occasional news report or social media post. Missed opportunity, but I suppose there's always the chance or possibility for an addition in future editions. Maybe a collected Bramblewood sometime in the future. The price will stay reasonable, of course. Now, as far as what really stood out for me, what I did love about the book Dracula was the Voyage of the Demeter. Other than the book itself being a amalgamation or conglomeration, whatever you want to call it, of vampire rules set down to paper, this is the standout section of the book. It is, of course, written from the perspective of the ship's officers, or the cargo ship Demeter moves boxes of earth or boxes of something from Romania to England through the Mediterranean, and stuff starts happening. It's kind of a boring, all by the numbers story at the beginning. They go through customs, weather's fine, but there's this eerie feeling on board, and after the third day, someone goes missing. The Voyage of the Demeter in the book is pure, isolated ship atmospheric horror. I just wish they had a solid movie focused on that. That is the standout part of the book for me, and the part that I have read and reread multiple times. The Voyage of the Demeter is classic horror, which I'm sure it had its inspirations from folklore or tales of the day, but as far as I can tell, this was a very particular set of circumstances that lends itself very well to the kinds of movies and books and audio dramas I listen to. Basically, the Voyage of the Demeter, I kind of see it as like a distant ancestor, not too distant ancestor, of Alien. I get the same vibe reading that chapter about the Voyage of the Demeter as I do when I rewatch Alien. Fantastic, wonderfully perfect atmospheric movie, just as that chapter in Dracula is. So, shout out to Bram Stoker for putting all the vampire lore into one book, so that people like me can... Thank you, Nugget. so that people like me can use it as a reference and draw on it for their own stories. Speaking of which, I do have two full-length novels available as ebooks and paperback. The first is They Come Out at Night, and the second is Larry's Cabin. Third is on the way, and it is called They Feed at Night. Cover work pending. In the meantime, if you want to get a sample of my work, there are two free stories available out there, which all fit in the same universe. One is called Sleeper's Key, and the other is Escape. I think Escape does really well as an intro into They Come Out at Night, and the forthcoming They Feed at Night. So check them out. Free anywhere where ebooks are available.